They had precisely 48 hours to pack their entire lives into cardboard boxes before the county sheriffs arrived. Desperate and nearly broke, they bought a derelict cabin deep in the New Hampshire woods for pennies, but beneath the rotting floorboards, they were about to unearth a chilling $1 million secret. The notice was taped to the door on a rainy Tuesday evening. It wasn't a polite letter, nor was it a warning. It was a brutal, legally binding declaration of eviction. David and Sarah Miller had lived in their modest, rent-controlled apartment in South Boston for 7 years. It was their sanctuary. David, a 32-year-old freelance graphic designer, and Sarah, a 30-year-old substitute teacher, had built a life within those 4 brick walls. But that life was dismantled the moment Gregory Finch, a ruthless property manager for Apex Holdings LLC, decided their building was worth more empty than occupied. Apex Holdings had purchased the entire block through a shell corporation. Within weeks, Finch exploited a notoriously shady legal loophole known as the Substantial Renovation Clause. By claiming the building needed urgent, structural overhauls that required the premises to be entirely vacant, they could legally bypass rent control and force everyone onto the street. Is greater than the reality of gentrification. Many long-term tenants find themselves legally outmaneuvered by multi-million-dollar real estate conglomerates, facing sudden homelessness despite years of on-time payments. David tried to fight. He pooled resources with the other tenants, hiring a local housing attorney named Thomas Kessler. For 3 agonizing months, they battled Apex Holdings in court. But Finch had an army of corporate litigators. They dragged out the proceedings, bleeding the tenants dry with legal fees. Eventually, the judge ruled in favor of the developers. The Millers were given 48 hours to vacate. "Where are we supposed to go, David?" Sarah had asked, sitting on the edge of their mattress, surrounded by a sea of half-taped moving boxes. Her voice was hollow, stripped of the vibrant energy that usually defined her. The Boston rental market was unforgiving. Rents had skyrocketed, and requiring first, last, and a hefty security deposit meant they needed nearly $10,000 just to get the keys to a comparable apartment. Between the legal fees and the sudden loss of David's biggest freelance client, a casualty of his inability to work during the court battle, their savings had dwindled to exactly $22,450. It was too much to qualify for assistance, but nowhere near enough to survive in the city. In a state of sheer panic, Sarah began scouring real estate foreclosure listings. They needed something permanent, something no landlord could ever take away from them. Late one night, her eyes locked onto a grainy, low-resolution photo on a county tax auction website. The property details. Location: Coos County, New Hampshire, deep in the Great North Woods. Lot size: 4.5 acres of dense, unmanaged timberland. Structure: a 1,200 square foot A-frame cabin, built in 1974. Price: $18,000. Cash only, as is condition. It was a staggering 4 hours away from everything they knew, nestled in a region notorious for harsh winters and total isolation. The previous owner, a man named Theodore Carmichael, had apparently passed away intestate, leaving behind a mountain of unpaid property taxes. "It's 18 grand, David. We can buy it outright," Sarah whispered, pointing at the screen. "We'd own it. No mortgage. No Gregory Finch. No one can ever kick us out again." David stared at the dilapidated cabin on the screen. The roof sagged, the windows were boarded up, and nature was actively reclaiming the porch. It was a nightmare of a fixer-upper, but as he looked at his wife's desperate, hopeful face, he knew they had no other choice. They wired the money to the county clerk the next morning. The drive up Interstate 93 was a silent, anxious journey. As they crossed into the northern reaches of the state, the cell service dropped, and the towering pines closed in around the 2-lane highway like dark, imposing sentinels. They stopped for gas and a hot meal at a local diner in a town with a population of less than 800. When David casually mentioned to the waitress, a stern-faced woman named Betty, that they had just bought the old Carmichael property, the diner seemed to grow uncomfortably quiet. "You folks bought Ted's place?" Betty asked, pausing with the coffee pot mid-pour. She exchanged a quick, unreadable glance with a man in a flannel shirt sitting at the counter. "Well, good luck to you." Old Ted wasn't just a recluse. The man was a paranoid survivalist. Never let anyone within 100 yards of that cabin, kept to himself, muttered about government confiscation. Just watch your step out there in those woods. The warning hung heavy in the air. Arriving at the property, the reality of their purchase hit them like a physical blow. The driveway was entirely washed out, forcing them to hike the last quarter-mile carrying their suitcases. The cabin itself smelled of damp earth, mildew, and decades of neglect. Animal droppings littered the hardwood floors, and the wallpaper was peeling away in long, sickly yellow strips. Their first night was spent huddled together on an air mattress in the center of the living room, surrounded by absolute, oppressive darkness. The silence of the forest was deafening, broken only by the eerie, rhythmic settling of the old house. They had escaped the corporate guillotine of the city, but as David stared up at the water-stained ceiling, he couldn't shake the creeping feeling that they had just trapped themselves in something far worse. Morning light did the cabin no favors, exposing the sheer scale of the rot. But anger and betrayal are powerful motivators. Fueled by the lingering sting of their eviction, David and Sarah channeled their frustration into raw, physical labor. For the first 3 weeks, they existed in a haze of dust and sweat. They tore out the moldy drywall, scrubbed the original hardwood floors with industrial bleach, and patched the gaping holes in the roof. Without a mortgage hanging over their heads, their remaining $4,000 stretched surprisingly far at the local hardware store. It was during the 4th week, while measuring the living room for new baseboards, that David noticed the discrepancy. He was an architectural graphic designer by trade. His brain was hardwired for spatial awareness and precise dimensions. He had sketched a rough floor plan of the cabin to figure out material costs. The house was essentially a simple rectangle, but the math wasn't adding up. The spatial discrepancy. Exterior length, 40 feet, measured from the outside foundation. Interior length, living room plus kitchen plus bedroom, 31 feet, accounting for wall thickness. Approximately 1 foot total. The missing space, 8 feet. Sarah, David called out, lowering his laser tape measure. Come look at this. He walked her through the measurements. At the center of the house, dividing the living room from the bedroom, was a massive, floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. It made sense that a chimney would take up space, but not 8 feet of solid depth. Maybe it's just a dead space? Sarah suggested, wiping drywall dust from her forehead. Like an old storage closet that got walled off? David walked to the stone fireplace, pressing his ear against the heavy river rocks, and knocked his knuckles against it. It sounded incredibly solid, but a nagging curiosity had taken root in his mind. He remembered Betty's words at the diner. Paranoid survivalist. Muttered about government confiscation. I need to look at the basement, David said, a sudden urgency in his voice. The basement was a cramped, unfinished cellar with a dirt floor and a low ceiling. They had mostly avoided it because it smelled strongly of sulfur and damp clay. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, David navigated down the creaking wooden stairs, Sarah close behind him. He pointed the beam toward the center of the basement, directly beneath the living room fireplace. There, rising from the dirt floor to the wooden joists above, was a solid wall of gray cinder blocks. It was crude work. The mortar was smeared and uneven, entirely different from the poured concrete foundation of the rest of the house. He built this later, David whispered, tracing his hand over the rough cinder blocks. Ted Carmichael walled off the entire center foundation. David didn't hesitate. He jogged upstairs and returned with a 10-pound sledgehammer. David, wait, are you sure? What if it's structural? Sarah cautioned, taking a step back. It's not bearing any weight. The floor joists run right past it, he replied. He took a wide stance, swung the sledgehammer back, and drove it hard into the center of the cinder block wall. Crack. Dust plumed into the stagnant basement air. He swung again, harder this time. The third strike shattered the center block, sending chunks of concrete tumbling into a dark void beyond. A rush of cold, stale air blew out from the hole, carrying a sharp, metallic scent. David grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the jagged opening. The beam cut through the darkness, reflecting off something dull and silver. What is it? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. David didn't answer. He just kept swinging. Adrenaline surged through him as he smashed away the cinder blocks, tearing down the false wall piece by piece until a large enough opening was cleared. They stepped over the rubble and into the hidden space. It was a perfectly square room, about 8 by 8 feet, sitting directly beneath the massive stone chimney. But it wasn't the room that made Sarah gasp out loud. Built seamlessly into the far wall, securely anchored into a reinforced steel frame, was a massive, circular steel door. It was a vintage Mosler bank vault door. It stood 6 feet tall, adorned with heavy steel locking bolts, a combination dial, and a large spoked turnwheel. It was the kind of door you would find in a high-security bank from the 1930s, weighing easily over a ton. The sheer impossibility of it sitting in the basement of a cheap, rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere left them completely paralyzed. "How did he even get this down here?" Sarah whispered, running her trembling fingers over the cold steel of the combination dial. "He didn't," David realized, looking around the hidden room. "He didn't bring the vault into the basement. He built the cabin, times around, times the vault. This was here first." David gripped the heavy steel spoked wheel and pulled. It didn't budge a millimeter. The vault was locked tight. The heavy steel dial spun smoothly, but without the combination, they were locked out. For the next 3 days, they became completely obsessed. The renovations on the rest of the cabin halted entirely. David spent hours online, sitting in his truck at the end of the driveway, just to get enough cell service to research vintage Mosler vaults. He learned that cracking a vault like this without damaging the contents required either an expert safecracker, which they couldn't afford, and didn't want to alert or brute force destruction of the locking mechanism. They opted for the latter. David returned from the hardware store in town with an industrial angle grinder, a dozen diamond-tipped cutting wheels, a heavy-duty pry bar, and a set of tungsten drill bits. The process was deafening and terrifying. Sparks showered the cramped, hidden room as David ground into the steel casing around the locking mechanism. The noise echoed up through the floorboards, a screeching mechanical wail that sounded like they were dissecting a metal beast. They worked in shifts, wearing safety goggles and ear protection, choking on the smell of burning steel. On the evening of the 3rd day, after snapping 3 drill bits and burning through 8 cutting wheels, David finally breached the inner tumbler housing. With a heavy steel punch and the sledgehammer, he drove the locking pin out of alignment. A loud, hollow clang times, resonated from deep within the door. David dropped the hammer. He looked at Sarah, who was gripping the edge of the cinder block wall, her face pale with anticipation. He stepped up to the vault, grabbed the spoked wheel, and pulled. With a deep, metallic groan that sounded like a tomb opening, the massive steel door slowly swung outward on its heavy hinges. The stale air from inside the vault rushed over them. David raised his flashlight and stepped into the darkness. This was no ordinary safety deposit box. The interior of the vault was lined with heavy steel shelving. On the left side sat a highly complex, vintage shortwave ham radio setup, flanked by towering stacks of sealed military-grade ammunition crates. But it was the center table that made David's blood run cold. Resting on a heavy wooden desk in the middle of the vault were dozens of thick, leather-bound ledgers. Next to them sat a stack of faded, yellowing blueprints. Sarah cautiously stepped past David, picking up the top blueprint. She unrolled it under the beam of the flashlight. It was a highly detailed schematic, but it wasn't for a house or a commercial building. "David," Sarah choked out, her eyes wide with terror and awe as she read the stamp on the bottom right corner of the blueprint. It was the complete, unrestricted architectural floor plan for the United States Federal Reserve Bank in Boston. And directly beside it, stacked in neat banded bricks, wrapped in plastic, was what appeared to be over $2 million in sequentially marked, uncirculated $100 bills. They hadn't just bought a house, they had bought a staging ground. The silence inside the subterranean vault was suffocating, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of 2 people whose reality had just been violently fractured. David's flashlight beam trembled, washing over the tightly wrapped bricks of $100 bills. The sheer volume of currency was an abstract concept made terrifyingly physical. Sarah was the first to move. She reached out with a shaking hand, lightly touching the thick plastic wrapping of the nearest stack. "David," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The bands! Look at the paper bands!" David leaned in, squinting in the harsh glare of the flashlight. Stamped across the faded white paper wrapping each brick of cash was a crisp, undeniable seal. Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Routing and Transit Series 1982. This isn't drug money, David muttered, his mind spinning as he processed the immensity of the situation. This is uncirculated currency. It never hit the streets. Ted Carmichael didn't just rob a bank. He intercepted a federal transfer. But the money, while visually staggering, was completely toxic. Even a novice like David knew that spending sequentially marked, uncirculated bills from a decades-old federal theft was a guaranteed, one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. The cash was a museum exhibit, beautiful but utterly useless to them. The true treasure and the true danger lay stacked on the heavy wooden desk. David set the flashlight on a shelf so it illuminated the room and pulled the first leather-bound ledger toward him. The book was heavy, its spine cracked with age. He opened it to the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, written in cramped, meticulous cursive. For the next 10 hours, completely ignoring the fact that they hadn't eaten or slept, David and Sarah sat on the cold steel floor of the vault, cross-referencing the ledgers with the blueprints. What they uncovered was a ghost story written in ink and blood. Theodore Carmichael was not a reclusive lumberjack. According to the internal documents and coded organizational charts stuffed inside the ledgers, Carmichael had been a ghost payroll architect and a master money launderer operating in the shadows of the 1970s and 80s Boston underworld. And he didn't work for just anyone. He worked for Gennaro Angiulo. His greater-than-historical context. Gennaro J. Angiulo was the real-life, ruthless underboss of the Patriarca crime family, ruling the Boston underworld from the North End. He was notorious for laundering millions of dollars in illicit mob profits through complex real estate shell companies before his historic FBI arrest in 1983. "My God, Sarah," David said, his finger tracing a line of faded blue ink. Carmichael was Angiulo's bagman for commercial real estate. When the feds started closing in on the Patriarca family in the early 80s, Carmichael panicked. He skimmed $2 million in a daring transit heist to fund his disappearance, stole the Federal Reserve blueprints as leverage in case he was ever caught, and vanished into the woods. The ledgers detailed every single property Carmichael had secretly purchased to wash Angiulo's blood money. He had built a labyrinth of corporate shell entities to hide the true ownership of dozens of lucrative Boston apartment buildings. Sarah pulled a newer-looking ledger from the bottom of the stack. Unlike the others, this one had entries dating up to just 3 years ago. Carmichael, in his paranoid isolation, had obsessively tracked the modern descendants of his shell companies. Ledger excerpt, asset tracking, entity transfer, asset ID, original shell, 1,981, current holding corp, status, prop, 404, Blue Line Management, Apex Holdings LLC, active gent, phase 3, prop, 405, North End Trust, Apex Holdings LLC, liquidated, prop, 409, Harborview Assoc, Apex Holdings LLC, active gent, phase 4. Sarah stopped breathing. Her eyes darted from the page to David, mirroring the exact moment of terrifying realization. "David," she gasped, pointing at the entry for times. Prop, 409. Beside it was a physical address jotted in the margins. It was their old address, the South Boston apartment building they had been brutally evicted from just 1 month prior. The cosmic irony hit them like a freight train. Gregory Finch, the ruthless property manager who had ruined their lives, wasn't just a greedy corporate suit. Apex Holdings LLC was the modern, sanitized evolution of a mafia shell company. Finch was systematically liquidating the old Patriarca family real estate portfolio, aggressively clearing out long-term tenants to flip the buildings for billions in clean, untraceable tech boom capital. Carmichael's death had left a massive, untied loose end. When he died of a heart attack in this isolated cabin, he died owing back taxes. The county seized the property, utterly unaware that it was owned by the most prolific money launderer in Boston history. Apex Holdings didn't even know this cabin existed because Carmichael had bought it under a completely disconnected alias. "They don't know," David whispered, a dangerous, electric thrill replacing his fear. Finch and his billionaire backers. "They don't know where the original ledgers are. They think the paper trail connecting their shiny new real estate empire to the 1980s mafia burned decades ago. Sarah looked at the $2 million in useless, marked bills, and then down at the rotting leather book in her hands. "This book," Sarah said, her voice turning ice cold, "is the silver bullet. It proves Apex Holdings is built on a foundation of federal crimes and mob racketeering. They weren't just victims of gentrification anymore. They were holding the detonator to a billion-dollar corporate empire. Fear is a primal instinct, but revenge, when meticulously planned, is a profound art form." David and Sarah did not call the local police. The local sheriff in a town of 800 people was entirely unequipped to handle a federal banking conspiracy and $2 million in stolen Federal Reserve cash. More importantly, handing the evidence over blindly meant they would lose all their leverage. Instead, they packed the ledgers, the Federal Reserve blueprints, and exactly one bundle of the marked $100 bills into a heavy waterproof duffel bag. They left the rest of the money sealed inside the Mosler vault, locked the heavy steel door, and drove back to civilization. They needed a very specific kind of monster to fight the monsters at Apex Holdings. They needed Thomas Kessler. Kessler, their former housing attorney, was a cynical, chain-smoking bulldog of a lawyer who despised corporate developers with a passion that bordered on pathological. When David and Sarah walked into his cramped downtown Boston office and dropped the ledger and the brick of $1,982 cash onto his desk, Kessler almost swallowed his cigar. "Tell me you didn't rob a bank, David," Kessler rasped, his eyes wide as he checked the serial numbers on the bills. "We didn't. But we found the man who did," David replied evenly. He spent the next hour walking Kessler through the nightmare, the cabin, the cinder block wall, the Mosler vault, and most importantly, the paper trail connecting Gennaro Angiulo to Gregory Finch and Apex Holdings. Kessler listened in absolute silence. When David finished, the lawyer leaned back, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "You understand what you have here?" Kessler asked, tapping the leather ledger. "You can't spend that cash. It's federal evidence. But these books, under the Department of Justice's Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Program and the SEC Whistleblower Framework, the government pays private citizens up to 30% of all recovered assets used in money laundering operations." Kessler leaned forward, the grin turning sharp. "Apex Holdings has a real estate portfolio worth roughly $400 million. If we hand this to the DOJ and they seize Apex's assets, you two stand to make tens of millions of dollars. Legally, cleanly. We don't just want the money," Sarah said, her voice steady and resolute. "We want Gregory Finch to look us in the eye when he loses everything." Kessler went to work. Operating under complete confidentiality, he brokered a highly classified meeting with the Boston field office of the FBI and the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Division. The federal agents were initially skeptical, assuming it was a desperate ploy by disgruntled tenants. But the moment Kessler produced the missing 1,982 Federal Reserve blueprints and the meticulous, verified handwriting of Theodore Carmichael, the room's atmosphere shifted from skepticism to absolute, lethal focus. A federal sting was authorized, but David and Sarah demanded one condition. Kessler had to set the trap using their eviction as the bait. Step 1. Kessler contacted Gregory Finch under the guise of a post-eviction settlement dispute. Step 2. He vaguely implied that the Millers had found historical documents in a rural property that heavily complicated Apex's ownership of the South Boston building. Step 3. A mediation meeting was scheduled in the glass-walled boardroom of Apex Holdings' luxury downtown headquarters. On a crisp Thursday morning, David, Sarah, and Kessler sat across a massive mahogany table from Gregory Finch. Finch looked exactly as David remembered him, impeccably dressed, arrogant, and wearing a smirk that suggested he was wasting his valuable time on peasants. "I don't understand what this is, Mr. Kessler," Finch sighed, checking his Rolex. "The eviction was perfectly legal. The renovation clause was upheld. If your clients are looking for a nuisance payout, you're barking up the wrong tree." "We aren't here for a payout, Greg," Kessler said smoothly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, high-resolution photocopy of a ledger page. He slid it across the mahogany table. Finch glanced at it, For a fraction of a second, his eyes locked onto the name times Gennaro Angiulo, connected by a drawn line to times Apex Holdings LLC. The color drained from his face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug in his neck. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a hollow, breathless panic. "Where did you get this?" Finch whispered, his voice stripped of all its corporate polish. "Theodore Carmichael says hello from the grave," David said, leaning forward. "He kept the receipts. Gregory. Every single one of them. He tracked the mob money straight into your corporate accounts. We know your entire portfolio is a laundering operation." Finch's hands began to shake. He looked at David, then at Sarah, realizing the profound, catastrophic mistake he had made by throwing them out onto the street. He had forced them right into the lap of his company's darkest secret. "Listen to me," Finch stammered, frantically leaning over the table. You have no idea who you're messing with. The people backing this company will kill you. If you give me the original books, I will cut you a check for $5 million right now, tax-free. I'll give you the deed to the South Boston building. Whatever you want." "We already have what we want," Sarah said softly, standing up from her chair. As if on cue, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. 6 federal agents, wearing tactical windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back, stepped into the room. Gregory Finch collapsed back into his leather chair, the fight completely leaving his body as an agent, read him his rights and slapped handcuffs over his expensive silk cuffs. The corporate guillotine had finally fallen, but this time, Finch was the one on the block. The fallout was historic. The DOJ raided Apex Holdings, freezing over $400 million in illicit real estate assets. The $2 million in stolen Federal Reserve cash was recovered from the New Hampshire vault and returned to the government, closing a 30-year-old cold case. Because David and Sarah provided the foundational evidence that led to the corporate seizure, the SEC whistleblower program awarded them a staggering 18% of the recovered liquid assets. 9 months later, David and Sarah Miller stood on the porch of their New Hampshire cabin. The rotting wood was gone. In its place stood a stunning, custom-built timber frame home with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the untouched wilderness. They never moved back to the city. The South Boston apartment building, seized by the feds, was transitioned into affordable housing under a new city grant. They had been pushed to the absolute edge of ruin by a system designed to crush them. But beneath the dirt and the rot, they had found the one thing the corporate machine could never anticipate: the perfect,